When a young Queen Elizabeth II looked into her jewelry box in the 1950s, it was almost empty of rubies. Why did the Queen of the United Kingdom, a woman who owned mountains of diamonds, pearls, and sapphires, spend decades almost entirely without the ultimate symbol of power and passion, the ruby? How was it possible that she started her reign with only one truly major ruby necklace, while her most important ruby tiara remained with her mother? Today, I will show you how, step by step, stone by stone, she built her own ruby collection from the ground up. From humble wedding gifts to regal masterpieces with their own histories and their own scandals. And believe me, there is something in this story that I guarantee you have never heard before. Before we begin, please support my channel by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. So, let's go back to the beginning. The year is 1952. A young woman, just 25 years old, learns that her father has died and that she is now queen. It's a moment of immense personal grief and overwhelming public duty. And as she steps into this new role, she inherits the keys to one of the most magnificent jewelry collections on Earth, the British crown jewels. But as she began to navigate the world of state banquets and diplomatic receptions, a curious gap in her collection would have become apparent. She had the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, a favorite from her grandmother. She had sapphires, a wedding gift from her father. She had a vault full of historic diamonds. But when it came to rubies, the stones of kings and queens, the collection was surprisingly sparse. The reason for this lies not in a state secret, but in a very human, very quiet family arrangement. You see, the most important ruby jewels of the crown were not actually with the new queen. They were still in the possession of her mother, the recently widowed Queen Elizabeth, who would soon be known to the world as the Queen Mother. The centerpiece of this collection was a truly spectacular tiara, Queen Victoria's Indian circlet. It was designed by Prince Albert himself, a truly historic piece, and it was designated an heirloom of the crown, which meant it legally belonged to the reigning monarch. But the Queen Mother had worn it as her signature piece for years, and after the king's death, she simply continued to do so. With it, she also retained the matching crown ruby necklace and earrings. It's easy to imagine the conversations, or perhaps the lack of them. The young Queen Elizabeth was known for her deep respect for her mother and for tradition. There was no public dispute, no grand confrontation. In fact, she reportedly said, with a kind of patient resignation, "Mummy will hand them back eventually." And so, for the foreseeable future, the grandest rubies of the realm would be seen not on the head of the reigning queen, but on her mother. This created a fascinating challenge for Elizabeth II. At the very start of her reign, as she was establishing her own image on the world stage, she had to build her ruby collection from a foundation of just a few, albeit beautiful, wedding gifts. And that is where our story truly begins. So, with the Grand Crown rubies out of reach, we must travel back a few years to 1947. This was a moment of national celebration, the wedding of Princess Elizabeth to Philip Mountbatten. Post-war Britain was still in the grip of austerity, and this royal wedding was a welcome splash of glamour and hope. Gifts poured in from all over the world, and for days the public could queue at St. James's Palace to gaze at the hundreds of presents on display. And it was here, amongst the dazzling tiaras and practical household items, that the first few red stones of her personal collection made their appearance. These weren't heirlooms of the crown, passed down with the weight of centuries. They were gifts given to a young bride. They formed the very bedrock of what would become her ruby wardrobe for decades. One of the most charming of these was a small, delicate brooch from a woman named Violet Bampfield, better known as the Dowager Countess of Onslow. It was a diamond and ruby butterfly, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It's a lovely, almost whimsical piece, not a grand statement of royalty, but a very personal, very feminine gift. And there's a wonderful little connection here for jewelry enthusiasts. The Countess of Onslow's brother was the man who, a decade later, would sell the family's famous Poltimore tiara. That tiara was, of course, purchased by Princess Margaret, who famously wore it for her own wedding. The Queen kept the butterfly brooch in her personal collection for her entire life. While it wasn't one of her most frequently worn pieces, it made a series of notable appearances in her later years. She chose it for a meeting of the Sandringham Women's Institute in 2012, for a church service at Crathy Kirk near Balmoral in 2019, and, most poignantly, for a video message to the COP26 climate conference, where it was seen next to a photograph of her late husband, Prince Philip. Then, from her formidable grandmother, Queen Mary, came a piece steeped in dynastic history, the Cornwall Rose of York bracelet. It was originally a wedding gift to Mary herself back in 1893, presented by the people of Cornwall. The letter from the Cornwall Royal Wedding Committee described it as a diamond and ruby bracelet, the center of which is in the shape of the Rose of York. What's so clever about its design is that this central rose motif, a nod to Mary's new title as Duchess of York, can be detached and worn separately as a brooch, something Queen Mary did on occasion. When Princess Elizabeth received it from her grandmother in 1947, it became a versatile and important part of her growing collection. She wore it for one of her earliest formal portraits as a young wife and mother, around 1950, pairing it with other wedding gifts. Throughout her reign, she would frequently choose this bracelet to complete her ruby ensembles for state banquets and formal occasions. It was the perfect companion piece, a beautiful and historic bracelet that elegantly tied together the grand ruby necklaces and earrings that formed the core of her collection, which we will be looking at next. Queen Mary also gifted her granddaughter a pair of classic ruby and diamond cluster earrings. These were originally a birthday present to Mary from her husband, King George V, in 1926, a large oval ruby surrounded by 9 brilliant cut diamonds. They are perfectly proportioned, timeless, and became an absolute staple for Queen Elizabeth. She wore them constantly, from her first Commonwealth tour in the 1950s right through to her final years. But here's where things get interesting for those of us who love to look closely. The Queen was also seen wearing another, strikingly similar pair of ruby cluster earrings. In this second pair, the central ruby appears slightly more rounded and is encircled by 15 diamonds, not 9. Their origin is a complete mystery. They simply appear in photographs from state banquets and official events. There are no records of them as a gift, no known commission. It's one of those little puzzles that makes studying these jewels so fascinating, a reminder that the vaults of Buckingham Palace don't give up all their secrets easily. But amidst these smaller, though deeply meaningful gifts, there was one truly magnificent piece that would become the cornerstone of her ruby collection for half a century. This was the Greville Ruby Necklace, a wedding present from her parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. This necklace has a fascinating history of its own. It was originally commissioned in 1907 from the famed Parisian jeweler Boucheron by Dame Margaret Greville, a celebrated society hostess and a close friend of the royal family. Upon her death in 1942, she bequeathed her spectacular jewelry collection, including this necklace, to the Queen's mother, Queen Elizabeth. In a letter to Queen Mary about the inheritance, the future Queen Mother wrote how touched she was, saying, "It is rather exciting to be left something, and I do admire beautiful stones with all my heart." From this incredible treasure trove, the King and Queen chose this Boucheron necklace as their gift to their daughter for her wedding. It was a perfect choice, a spectacular floral bandeau of rubies and diamonds, shaped into a distinctive V with a large pear-shaped diamond pendant. It was grand enough for a future queen, and it filled that crucial gap in her ruby wardrobe. And for decades, this necklace was her workhorse. It was her one and only major ruby necklace. She debuted it in 1951 during a tour of Canada, pairing it with the Nizam of Hyderabad Tiara for a banquet in Ottawa. And soon after receiving it, she had the necklace shortened to better suit the fashionable style of the time, which favored jewels that sat closer to the throat. The two sections that were removed have been kept in the royal vaults, meaning it could one day be restored to its original length. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, she wore it constantly for state occasions and for numerous official portraits and galas. It was her ruby anchor, a constant and brilliant reminder of her parents' love and foresight. For a very long time, this was the jewel that had to do the work of an entire parure, and it did so beautifully. So, by the early 1960s, a practical reality of the Queen's reign had become clear. She was more than a decade into her rule, an established and respected figure on the world stage, yet for all the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, her ruby options for the grandest state occasions remained limited. The Great Crown rubies, the Indian circlet, and its accompanying parure were, of course, heirlooms of the crown. But they were also the signature jewels of her mother, the Queen Mother, a deeply beloved public figure who continued to represent the monarchy at home and abroad. Out of deep respect for her mother and her role, it seems an unspoken arrangement was in place. The Queen Mother would continue to wear the jewels she was so closely associated with. This meant that for the reigning monarch, a different path was needed. If the Queen wanted a more versatile and appropriate ruby wardrobe for her own duties, she would have to build it herself. And this is where we see her resourceful and forward-thinking character come to the fore. The next phase of her collection wouldn't be defined by waiting for heirlooms, but by her own deliberate, strategic choices. This period saw the quiet addition of a couple of very stylish bracelets to her collection, both of which speak to different aspects of how a collection grows. One is a beautiful Art Deco piece, a symphony of geometric diamond links interspersed with 4 rich oval rubies. We know this one was a legacy from her grandmother, Queen Mary, bequeathed to her in 1953. It's a classic, elegant design that feels both historic and timeless. The Queen wore it for decades, often for very grand occasions like the state opening of Parliament or state dinners, a quiet link to the grandmother who had so shaped the modern royal jewelry collection. Another bracelet also began appearing in photographs around the early 1960s. This one is quite different. It's more modern in feel, with distinctive oval plaques of rubies surrounded by brilliant cut diamonds. Unlike the Art Deco piece, its origins are a complete mystery. We don't know if it was a gift or a private purchase. It simply enters the rotation and becomes a familiar sight, often paired with her grander ruby necklaces. I always find these little mysteries so intriguing. They're a reminder that for all the public scrutiny, the Queen's private collection still holds its secrets. But bracelets, however lovely, don't solve the central problem of a state banquet. The Queen needed another substantial necklace, and in 1964, she made a decisive move. She purchased what is now known as the Burmese Ruby Necklace. This is a key moment in our story. This wasn't a gift from a head of state or an inheritance. This was a strategic acquisition, reportedly bought at auction from the aristocratic Baring family. It was the Queen, as a collector, making a conscious decision to fill a specific gap in her own collection. Now, I have to be honest, the Baring necklace is a piece that divides opinion among jewelry lovers, and I can see why. It's composed of 18 ruby and diamond clusters leading to a central diamond element, from which 3 large flat-cut ruby pendants are suspended. The royal collection itself notes that these 3 pendants were likely once a pair of earrings and a separate pendant, which were later combined to create this necklace. And I think that assembled nature is what some people find a bit challenging. It doesn't quite have the seamless, flowing design of a piece that was conceived and created as a whole. It's seen by some as a functional, rather than an inspirational piece of jewelry. Personally, I really appreciate the pragmatism of it. The Queen needed a versatile ruby necklace that was perhaps a little less formal and easier to wear than the grand Greville. This one, with its slightly more delicate scale, fit the bill perfectly. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, and I think that says a lot about her no-nonsense approach. Some critics have hoped it might one day be semi-retired or even reworked, perhaps back into its original components. But I'm curious what you all think. Is it a piece you admire for its utility, or do you feel it could perhaps benefit from a redesign? Let me know your thoughts. Regardless of any aesthetic debates, the Queen put it to immediate and frequent use. It became a true workhorse of her collection for the next 2 decades. She paired it with the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara for a visit to Malta in 1967. She wore it for state visits to France and Denmark in the 1970s and for multiple state openings of Parliament. For years, the bearing ruby necklace was the go-to piece when the Greville wasn't quite right for the occasion. It was a testament to her resolve. If the heirlooms of the crown were unavailable, she would simply create her own treasury. So, by the mid-1960s, she had 2 major ruby necklaces and a few bracelets and brooches. The situation had improved, but the most significant gap remained. The one item a queen truly needs for the grandest of state occasions was still missing from her personal vault. She still didn't have a ruby tiara of her own. And the solution to that final, crucial problem would be the most dramatic, and some would say, the most controversial jewelry decision of her entire reign. And so we arrive at 1973. For 20 years, the Queen had navigated the world's grandest state occasions without a ruby tiara to call her own. She had patiently waited, she had strategically purchased, and now she was ready to create. She commissioned the House of Gerard to create a new tiara, one that would be built not from newly acquired stones, but from 2 of her most meaningful wedding gifts. The rubies themselves were a remarkable gift from 1947 from the people of Burma. The gift consisted of precisely 96 rubies, and according to Burmese belief, these stones are a talisman protecting the wearer from 96 diseases that can afflict the human body. For a monarch who would live to be 96, it's a detail that feels almost prophetic. These weren't just any stones. They were a gift laden with goodwill and protective symbolism. For the diamonds and the framework, the Queen turned to another of her wedding presents, the beautiful, delicate floral Nizam of Hyderabad Tiara, a piece she had chosen herself from Cartier. And here is where the controversy begins. To create her new ruby tiara, the Nizam of Hyderabad Tiara was dismantled. The central floral elements were kept and can still be worn as brooches today. Thank goodness for that. But the tiara frame itself was sacrificed. For many jewelry lovers, this was an unthinkable act. The Nizam tiara was a masterpiece of 1930s Cartier design, airy and elegant. To break it apart to create something new felt, to some, like an act of vandalism, and I completely understand that sentiment. It's always a sad moment when a historic piece is lost. The new creation was the Burmese Ruby Tiara. It features a wreath of heraldic Tudor roses, with the Burmese rubies forming the center of each flower, surrounded by petals of brilliant cut diamonds. And it has to be said, the design is unmistakably of the 1970s. It's bold, it's graphic, and it is a world away from the delicate Edwardian and Art Deco pieces in the royal collection. Now, this tiara gets a lot of criticism. It's often called blocky or clunky, and many feel its design doesn't do justice to the magnificent stones. And I'll admit, in photographs, I can see what they mean. The floral motifs can sometimes look like simple red and white circles. But I feel this tiara gets a rather unfair reputation, largely because its creation story is so tied to the loss of the beloved Nizam. I suspect if we didn't know about that sacrifice, we might look at it very differently. And I've heard from people who have seen this tiara in person, on display at Buckingham Palace, and they all say the same thing. It is absolutely breathtaking. They say that what you can't appreciate from a photograph is the incredible workmanship, the quality of the stones, and the three-dimensional depth of each rose. What looks flat in a picture is, in reality, a beautifully executed and brilliantly constructed object. It is, by all accounts, simply stunning in person. And, for me, the symbolism here is what truly matters. The Queen didn't just create a tiara, she created a statement. By combining the Burmese rubies, a gift from a Commonwealth nation, with the diamonds from an Indian princely state and setting them in the form of the Tudor rose, the quintessential emblem of England, she forged a piece that was uniquely hers, It represented her history, her role, and her realm. It may not be to everyone's taste, but it was undeniably her tiara. With its creation, the 50-year ruby problem was at last truly and definitively solved. She now had a complete parure of her own making. With the creation of the Burmese tiara, the era of the ruby vacuum was officially over. The queen now possessed a complete, grand parure of her own making. This freed her to evolve her collection in a new way. The acquisitions and commissions that followed were no longer about filling a critical gap. They were about adding diversity, personality, and reflecting her role on an ever-changing world stage. In the 1980s, this was beautifully illustrated by a magnificent diplomatic gift. During a state visit in 1985, the Emir of Qatar presented the Queen with a stunning demi-parure. It consists of a swag-style diamond necklace featuring a centerpiece of 2 large, smooth cabochon rubies with a matching pair of earrings. It's a very different style from her other pieces. The use of cabochon stones and rich yellow gold gives it a distinctly modern and opulent feel. I find it fascinating how she integrated this new style into her existing wardrobe. She wore the Qatari rubies frequently, often pairing them with her Burmese Ruby Tiara, creating a powerful contemporary look that was all her own. But perhaps the most treasured ruby in her entire collection wasn't a state gift or a commissioned piece, but a gift of love from her husband, dating all the way back to 1966. This is the Greville Ruby Brooch. It was a present from Prince Philip, whose taste always leaned towards the modern and innovative. He acquired it from the celebrated jeweler Andrew Greville, a pioneer of modern British jewelry design. In fact, Greville's rise to royal prominence was partly thanks to the Queen's brother-in-law, Lord Snowdon, who had championed more interesting and contemporary design. This brooch, with its abstract sunburst of textured gold, scattered diamonds, and a magnificent central carved ruby, is a perfect example of that bold new style. The Queen first wore it in 1966, and it remained a quiet favorite for decades. But its true significance became clear in her later years. She chose this very personal gift for the official portraits marking her 70th wedding anniversary with Prince Philip in 2017. A deeply sentimental choice. And after his passing, it became one of her most poignant pieces of jewelry, worn for her first solo engagement after his funeral. It was more than a jewel. It was a memory of her husband's love and his modern spirit, worn close to her heart. Alongside these significant pieces, the Queen's collection of other brooches also continued to grow. One of my favorites from this period is a piece known as the Modern Ruby and Diamond Spray Brooch. It's a very elegant mid-century design with a sweeping spray of diamonds and a slender curving line of rubies set in gold. Its exact origins are unknown, but we know it has been in her jewelry box for a very long time, making one of its earliest appearances back in 1965. It's a piece she wore consistently for over half a century, a versatile and understated choice for a whole range of events. Another charming floral piece is a brooch that for years presented something of a puzzle known as the Ruby Posy Brooch. It was long thought to have been a personal gift from Prince Philip. However, thanks to the diligent work of jewelry historians and enthusiasts, it's now understood that it was actually a gift to the Queen from the city of Bristol during a visit in 1954. Its design is based on a real flower called the Flower of Bristol, which was used to decorate the city's new council house that she was there to open. Knowing this context just brings the piece to life, doesn't it? It transforms it from a simple floral brooch into a lovely public memento. And even as she acquired new pieces, the Queen continued to thoughtfully commission others. At some point, she had a lovely pair of earrings made, known as the Ruby Floret earrings. They are delicate, miniature flowers, with rubies edged in a circle of brilliant and baguette-cut diamonds, created using stones from her private collection. She would often wear them with her Burmese Ruby Tiara, a perfect subtle match. And then, in the spring of 2002, a long and remarkable life came to a close with the passing of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. It was the end of an era, and with it came a quiet, significant moment of transition for the royal collection. After 50 years, the great ruby heirlooms of the crown were formally reunited with the main collection in the sovereign's vault. First among them was the tiara that had, in many ways, defined this story, Queen Victoria's Indian circlet. For half a century, it had been the signature jewel of the Queen Mother, and now it was with her daughter, the reigning queen. But by this point in her reign, the queen had her own signature ruby tiara, the Burmese, a piece born of her own story and symbolism. Her decision to wear the Indian circlet just once, during a state banquet in Malta in 2005, feels less like a long-awaited debut and more like a respectful nod to its history. She didn't need to make it her own. She was simply its custodian for the next generation. However, the rest of the parure, the spectacular necklace and earrings, and the enigmatic crown ruby brooch, were pieces the queen seemed to embrace more personally in her later years. It took some time, but in 2015, during a state visit to Germany, she appeared wearing the full suite. It was a breathtaking sight. The jewels, once worn by her great-great-grandmother Victoria and then her own mother, were finally showcased by the reigning monarch in all their glory. But for me, the most powerful moment came in 2019 during the state visit of the American president. On that evening, the Queen paired the crown ruby necklace and earrings with her very own Burmese Ruby Tiara. It was her personal story and the story of the crown, told in a single, breathtaking ensemble. It was about showing how her own contributions now stood alongside the great heirlooms of the past. With their return, her collection was now complete in a way it hadn't been before. It was a collection built first from gifts, then through her own strategic purchases and personal commissions, and finally, completed by the natural course of time and inheritance. And so, the story of the Queen's Ruby collection is one of remarkable patience and personal vision. A collection that began with just a few precious wedding gifts was carefully and thoughtfully built, stone by stone, over a lifetime, until it stood complete, blending deep family history with her own unique legacy. But of course, the story of these magnificent jewels never truly ends. It simply begins a new chapter, and we are already seeing this legacy unfold. Queen Camilla has now worn the Burmese Ruby Tiara, the very piece her late mother-in-law created with such personal symbolism, and on one occasion, she beautifully paired it with that elegant Art Deco ruby bracelet that Queen Mary had passed down to Elizabeth. It's a wonderful sight, linking 4 generations of queens through a single stunning ensemble. The life of these rubies continues. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. I would love to know what you think. What are your thoughts on this incredible ruby collection? And are you, like me, hoping to one day see the magnificent Indian circlet make a return? If you enjoyed this story, I would be so grateful if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and perhaps share it with a friend who also appreciates these timeless tales, so you don't miss our next exploration into the royal vaults. Until next time, thank you for watching.